Take your Bibles, please, and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 will begin in verse 14. I want to say thank you all that were a part of the revival this week and appreciate your participation and your attendance. And as I told the men in men's prayer, revival starts now. And let me encourage you to take what God has told you to do and follow Him in obedience. Thank you for being here this morning as well. I know it's been a long week, and I hope you're not tired of hearing preaching. Okay, I'm excited about being in First Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 14 says, "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as the wise men, judge ye what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Christ. Is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread in one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel, after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? We'll cover the rest of the chapter tonight, but I want to look at once again, I think you probably figured it out that we're still talking about those that meat offered to idols that we started talking about in chapter 8, and some more instruction that Paul is going to give us concerning what we should do with that meat, what they should do with that meat that was offered to idols. Lord, I pray you'd help us now just to tune in to your word. And I know there is physical weariness of the week. We're thankful that we were able to have time together. And I know that there may be some distractions from this morning, but I pray that we not miss out on the truth you have for us. Help us now, Lord. And Lord, thank you for the truth you've given us. And thank you for the fellowship we're able to have in you. And I pray that that would be a focus for us now. That, Lord, really we need nothing else because we have you. We have the fellowship in you. And I pray that after even today, that would be even more solid and understood for us, that we need nothing else if we have you. Speak to us now, Lord, and help us to listen in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. Well, once again, I remind you that what we are talking about here is something that started in chapter 8. When the Corinthians, the church here, had asked Paul about those that meat that was offered to idols, we have kind of been dealing with that ever since then. And Paul begins to teach that very important principle, a very important principle to the Christian life. And that principle really just kind of can be summed up that when a Christian loves God, he also loves fellow man. And this in turn will cause him to forego some certain privileges or certain rights that he might have in his life. Verse 8 or chapter 8 was really, that was the center of, yes, you may have liberty to do so, but I pray that you love your fellow man, your fellow believer, more than you love your rights and your privileges. And chapter 9, Paul also said that I'll give an example of my life. I'll let you know that as an apostle, I truly had some privileges and rights that I could have capitalized on, but I chose not to for the sake of others. And then we got the picture of Israel and the history lesson of Israel that happened here in chapter 10, and how Israel abused that privilege and essentially lost blessings from God because they chose to make themselves happy rather than to care about God and others. And so Paul's just kind of been walking them through this idea. And boy, this must have been a pretty big problem in the church, right? I mean, and it almost, this is the one thing that they really are concerned about in writing to him, and he seems to be very concerned to give them an answer. And so he's been dealing with it for a while, and he's already given a reason to abstain from these meats that were often to pagan idols, and he because of the love for a brother. But he doesn't stop there. Paul continues on and gives us another reason why they should abstain from the eating of this meat. Yes, you should consider your fellow brother that may be weaker, and you may cause them to stumble, and you should love them enough that you do not want to see them stumble. But Paul's mind, it does not stop there. He says here in the first verse of our text, he says, "Flee from idolatry." Now, he's already told them in chapter 6 to flee from fornication. Now he's telling them to flee from idolatry. And Paul seems to know something maybe that we don't know about the Corinthian believers. And uh, obviously, he would probably know more about these pagan temples where the meat was being offered. And if you remember that this would have probably been meat that was offered to the pagan idols and then brought into the outer courts of the temple and then sold. And many believe it was probably cheaper meat. It was more accessible, right? And so these Corinthians probably saw an opportunity, and there were those that were more mature that saw it as not a problem, recognizing idols aren't really God, right? And recognizing that they are just simply, images made by man. And there were those that were more mature to recognize that, and they thought, man, cheap, accessible meat, sign me up, There may have even been some eating of this meat in the temple, and I think we might be dealing a little bit with that more so in our text today. And I think Paul is watching all of this and hearing all this going on, and it sends up a red flag in his mind. There's some caution, there's some reservation that Paul has with these believers that have decided that it's okay to eat and eat this meat, maybe whether it's in or out of the temple, but they have decided it's okay to eat this meat. And it seems that maybe they have gone to the edge of what's permissible, and Paul feared that they might be drawn in even further, that they are now partaking of some meat that was offered to idols. That in and of itself wasn't necessarily wrong, but he understands the environment in which they were partaking of the meat, or the place in which they were going to take or to partake of the meat or purchase the meat. He was starting to recognize and wanting to send a word of caution to these believers that this may not be best for you. You need to think about this. This is maybe, yes, again, you have a right. And I kind of struggle if Paul is saying that they should not eat this meat, like this is a hard no, or if he's just giving word of caution as well. But Paul, by the words "flee idolatry," that kind of takes this idea of eating meat to another level, doesn't it? I mean, we were just talking about having a T-bone steak. I mean, it was just meat, right? I mean, I didn't think eating meat was all. I mean, we just learned this week that if a meal doesn't have meat, it's not worth eating, right? Brother Woodcock was very clear about that. So we at first, okay, we understand the offending of a brother, um, but now it seems as Paul is taking it to another level. Like there's a strong word of warning to these believers that they need to be aware of. There's a great danger for them, and he's trying to convince them to be careful of something. Very clear, I guess, idolatry. Be clear or be careful of idolatry, he's telling them here. And Paul tries to convince them that going and partaking of this meat is getting on the verge. I believe he's communicating and trying to caution them that they're getting on the verge of committing idolatry. Eating meat's one thing, idolatry is a totally another thing, right? I mean, that's serious business. The idea of idolatry is not something just to kind of shrug off or laugh about. That is, and especially in biblical times and even today, I mean, there's only one God. And idolatry is simply saying this, that I have another God or a God alongside of the one and true God. It is choosing to place worship where worship doesn't belong. And Paul is recognizing something about the believers here, and he's trying to enforce and encourage them to follow and practice the doctrine, or maybe the doctrine or the principle, the truth of separation. There is a danger here for the believers, and Paul wants to warn them that if they're not careful, unbeknownst to them, they're flirting with idolatry. He tells them here, flee it, flee, run from it. We know idolatry again to be the worship of a false god, an image. And it results, what's dangerous about that, once we worship the false image, then we start to follow the false religion, and we start to be led by false teachers, and right, it's a snowball domino effect that happens from that, and it's dangerous. It's a dangerous path for us to go down. And idolatry does not necessarily always have to be the worship of a physical image. It can be worship of an idea or thought. And Paul says here to them in the very first verse of our text, he tells them to flee idolatry. Don't entertain, do not flirt, don't tolerate idolatry. Remember, this is not their temples. This is a pagan temple. They were following after false gods, and they were Satan's so good about this, right? This is what Satan does. He mimics what God does. He's still doing that today. And on the surface, maybe it would have looked okay. It's like, well, that's kind of like what the Christians are doing over here, you know. And but Paul recognizes, no, there's something inherently wicked about what's going on here, and just the culture that is involved there. And he says this is not something to play around with. They shouldn't try to see how close they could come to it without participating in it. Instead, they should be more focused on how far they can get away from it. Paul says, flee idolatry. I think he's communicating that there is something wrong with the eating of this meat. There's something wrong to it. I do lean towards that Paul is really communicating here that they should stay away from this meat that's been offered to idols. I really do. I really feel like he's leaning. This isn't, he'll tell us later on, this isn't the only way to get meat. Satan loves to tell us, hey, this is all there is. There isn't anything else. Then this is more convenient. You must run after this. You must embrace this. This person in your life, this idea in your life, this pursuit or goal or possession in your life. This is all there is, and you must run after it. He tells you that, and he's lying to you because he knows that this will lead you further and further away from God and cause you to worship that instead of worshiping God. When God is saying, wait a second, I'm the creator of this universe. I'm the God of this world. You don't think I can't provide for you? I can't give you what you need. I can't give you what you want. You think that that's it? God is not lacking, right? They were following after the meat there in the temple there, and Paul is saying you're getting dangerously close to idolatry. And it makes sense because we already know in chapter 8 that there's a group of believers that recognize that these idols were really just nothing. And they were. They were just stone or metal or whatever they were made of. They were just they were man made objects. They're like my car. I'm not worshiping my car. It's finicky, right? I don't trust it. That's essentially what they're doing. And there was a group of believers that recognized, I mean, that's the first step to fall into believing what's false is to think, it's nothing. It's not going to hurt me. That's the first step. Satan is pulling people in every day by getting them to the place where they simply just say, it's not going to hurt me. It's not a problem. It'll be okay. I mean, I can partake in that. It's not as bad as somebody else. I can go into that place. I can be with that group of friends or coworkers. It'll be okay. And that is the first step into falling into or into believing that which is not true. You sometimes it even starts by saying, "Well, I can put that before God. It won't hurt." You start to essentially worship that over God. And there are these believers in chapter 8 that we have already identified to understand that these idols are really just nothing. But Paul says that's dangerous. You're in a dangerous place. Look, we know many of them probably came out of paganism. The worst thing to do is to take somebody out of sin and allow them to take some semblance of that sin back or indulge in some semblance of that sin. It's the worst thing you could do. I mean, we talk about it all the time with people with addictions. The worst thing they could do is to be indulging in a part of that addiction. No. What you should do is flee, run. And here we have a group of people that had lived the world of had lived in a world where they served pagan gods. And now they are going back into those pagan temples. And sure, they're not going in there to serve or worship. They're just going in there to get their groceries, to get a meal. But Paul says, whoa, careful. You are on the brink of idolatry. Be careful. Run away from it. Flee it. That's a command that goes way back to the 10 Commandments God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. Isaiah 42:8, I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, neither my praise to a graven image. This is nothing new. No, this idea that we should flee from idolatry, flee from the worship of a false image, that should not come as new news for us even today. We even know in chapter 7 of this text that Israel displeased God because a lapse in idolatry. He tells them that in the history lesson about Israel, Paul tells the believers there, neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, talking about Israel. Paul is issuing this warning here. And he gives us the assumption that these believers are on the verge of committing idolatry by partaking of this meat that was offered to idols. And so, since the Corinthians tended to pride themselves on their wisdom, Paul challenges them in verse 15. I speak to you as wise men. Judge ye what I say. So Paul's going to give them some wise counsel about their participation of eating this meat that's offered to idols, and he's going to do it on the premise of cautioning them falling into idolatry. Notice what he does first. He lays some groundwork for his instruction by communicating the truth of the Lord's Supper. Verses 16 and 17, I can almost hear them hear the words flee from idolatry and them going, what's he talking about? Right? What's the problem here? We're just going in for some meat and getting some meat and coming out. And sure, it may have been that at the beginning, but there's no guarantee it was going to stay there. Paul recognized that. And so Paul says, okay, I need you to see something. And he says, I'm gonna start with the idea of another meal of, of sorts, right? And he talks about the Lord's Supper. In verses 16 and 17, he communicates the truth there. And the Lord's Supper shows a twofold fellowship with Christ. He uses the word communion there. In verse 16, he says, the cup of the blessing which we bless, is it not the communion? The word communion there means a partnership or fellowship. And he's communicating there that the communion of the fellowship of the blood of Christ shows us to be partakers of his suffering and death. And the fellowship, the communion of the body of Christ shows us to be partakers of his life and to live in harmony and fellowship with him. Look, the Lord's Supper is about us coming together in agreement with God and with each other, about who God is and what he had done, and remembering his blood and his body and the sacrifice he went through, and us agreeing with that, and coming into fellowship with him, saying, Lord, I want that closeness with you. I want that relationship with you. And he says, when you take of the Lord's Supper, he's simply saying you're communicating this when you when you partake of the Lord's Supper. And he'll talk later on about the Lord's Supper, but he says when you take the Lord's Supper, you're communicating that he uses the words, we're one with God, fellowship with God. He uses the word communion, right? He's saying that we are locked arms with him. We are in agreement with him. Isn't that true? When you're in fellowship with someone, you're in agreement with them, right? Otherwise, not a lot of fellowshipping is going on. Those of you that are married, there are times when there's not a lot of fellowshipping going on because there's not a lot of agreement, right? Once the agreement happens, fellowshipping starts again. And the ordinance, the practice of the Lord's Supper, Paul is just using this as an illustration to communicate to them the danger of eating the meat that's offered to idols. And he starts by saying, you know that thing called the Lord's Supper, you understand the truth of it and what it means about our fellowship and our connection and our agreement with God. To participate in that means you are in fellowship with it, you are in agreement with it. And so he's saying when you partake of the bread and the drink there, you're identifying with what Christ has done and who he is. And in verse 17, he also says that it not only brings the Christian into fellowship with Christ, but it also brings him into fellowship with the whole body of Christ. For we being one, or for we being many, are one bread and one body. We are all partakers of that one body. You see the picture of unity and agreement and fellowship and connection and partnership. Do I need any more words? Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, that's what's so sweet about the Lord's Supper. That's part of the reason why when we do it on an off night, because we want to create that connection with people that are like-minded and those that we are already in fellowship with, right? I mean, that's what makes it so special and intimate, is that it's just us. And we're coming together as one in fellowship with God and with each other. And I love the connection that it creates. And Paul's just using this as an example and trying to, he'll illustrate or he'll explain it in a moment, but understand what he's communicating is partaking of the supper communicates communion. It communicates agreement and fellowship. Does that make sense? I can imagine the believers going, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah." I mean, yeah. I mean, kind of like what we do. Like, yeah, that's what I love about the Lord's Supper, and it's so special in that way. Once again, in verse 18, he's still kind of building some groundwork, some foundation, as he's going to give the instruction to the believers here in a moment. But he gives some more groundwork here and foundation by looking at the history of Israel. In verse 18, behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifice partakers of the altar? Again, the sacrifice that was being done by the believers or by Israel communicated their oneness with God, their agreement with God, their desiring to be in fellowship. Right, the sacrifices, many of them were set out to make things right between Israel and God. And he's just communicating there that again, we like he looked at the supper, now he's looking at the sacrifice side of it, and he's really kind of communicating. Both of them are saying this, that we are in agreement with God. We are in fellowship with God. That's all he's trying to communicate there. And they're all going, yeah, that's I know. That's how I feel. It says you have this connection, this partnership, this fellowship with God, and it's it's like Paul's setting them up, right? He's setting them up for a lob, and he's going to hit it out of the park, man. He's ready to do that. Here it is. He says, you know that fellowship you have with Christ. He says that fellowship with Christ commits you to flee anything pertaining to idols. Verse 19. What say I then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? He recognizes that on the surface they would seem to be just nothing. It's just meat being offered to a statue, right? Not, I mean, on the surface, it doesn't look like it's much. Boy, Satan would love for us to stop right there. And don't worry. Yeah, just look on the surface. It's not harmful. There's really nothing wrong with it on the surface. There's really not a problem with this. It's gonna be okay. But yeah, hey, what's behind that door? No, 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 no! Don't look behind that door. What's under those covers? No, 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 no. There's nothing under there. Can I look under the bed? No, you don't want to look under the bed. You know, no one cleans under the bed. It looks pretty bad. I'll get that later. But you just need to look right here, right? Just stand right in the doorway and look around. I mean, can how many of you know that's a terrible way to buy a house? Some of you just recently bought a house. Maybe that's how you bought it. I'm sorry, but uh, I mean to walk in the front door and go, "Yep, I think this will do." You want an inspection? Nah, I did enough inspecting. I got it all figured out. Well, there's an attic. You might want to. Nah, I don't need to look in an attic. Would you like to look at the hot water heater? No, I'm good. Satan would love for us just to have that kind of inspection, right? Because if he can kind of get a hook in us, right, get us to take that first step, he knows what's waiting for us. Paul says, yeah, on the surface, it doesn't look like much. I get that, and I understand, and I'm not naive. But notice the first word of verse 20. But, I know it doesn't look like much, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. On the surface, and even to the world, it doesn't look like it's harmful. But Paul doesn't want them to start to believe that this is harmless. If it means something to eat at the Lord's table, then it means something to eat at the table of the idols as well. sacrifices, he says, I need you to remember this. I need you to remember not just what the meat is, but I need you to remember the culture and the idea that surrounds that meat. You're right. Eating the meat probably meant nothing. But remember, they were walking into these pagan temples to purchase that meat. They were in connection with some of those pagan priests, those false teachers, in the process of purchasing that meat. I mean, they were in that culture. And Paul's going, whoa, 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 time out. You're on enemy territory. Be careful. And the Corinthians were thinking, no, I mean, don't worry about us, Paul. I mean, we're just getting some meat. We're going to get in, get out. Yeah, today and maybe even tomorrow. But Paul says, before long, you run the risk of idolatry. You run the risk, remember, you run the risk of falling back into what you used to do, being what you used to be. And Paul says, I need you to be aware of the danger of eating the meat, not just eating the meat, but being a part of that culture. Well, Paul, where else are we going to get meat? It is clear in every history reading that I did that this was not the only place to get meat. Very clear. Well, I might have to spend more there. You don't think God can give you the money to buy that meat if you are honoring Him? I don't know how many times I've done things because I wanted to abstain. I'll mention this in a minute, but abstain from the appearance of evil. And it cost me more money to do so, but God provided and I was okay. Don't listen to the lies of Satan. He's telling you, no, 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 you have to do that. Only place, only price. I'm sorry, that's the only. Look, the only place to get, and I know this is kind of silly, but the only place to get a soda is not a bar. All right? I can go on and on and on, but that's what Satan will tell you. Paul says, but I say that the images or that the sacrifice is being done. I need you to remember this, Corinth. I need you to understand that is not a good place. That's not a healthy place for a believer. There is actual sacrifices being done to the devils. That is paganism. That's wickedness, and they are worshiping someone and something other than God. And he says that's wrong for a believer to partake in any of that. And he's simply saying, be careful. You're you're flirting with sin. They weren't at this point necessarily involved in the worship of these gods, but I think they may have been a little ignorant on where it could be heading. And can I tell you, their ignorance did not make it any less true that they could fall into the worship of idols. Look, Satan and his demons, they're masterminds behind pagan idolatry and false religion and the systems out there, the cults that are out there. They're good at what they do. I say this all the time. We think we can outsmart Satan. You can't. He's been at it for a long time. He was created by God. He was pretty high up on the list, right? I mean, he knows what he's doing, and you can't outsmart God or Satan. You can't outsmart God either, though. It's interesting. He says here, up above in verse 16, he said communion or fellowship. And really, that is good fellowship. When we're in the Lord's Supper and we're having communion with God and we're in fellowship with God, that is sweet, that is right, that is holy. But then he says in verse 20, be careful. I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Says you're in danger of being in cahoots with the devils themselves. Look, I'm sure many of them in the Corinth church are like you and I today, and they'd say, no, no, that would never happen. And I wish I had a dollar bill for every time I've heard that. How many times I've heard people say, no, 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 you don't understand. I mean, I was youth pastor for several years, and I don't know how many times I heard teenagers go, it's going to be okay. Don't worry about me. I'm going to go hang out with my friends tonight. We're going to party all night. We're going to do whatever we're going to do. And it's going to be okay, only to find out something, maybe not the first night, maybe not the fifth night, but I can tell you, the longer you flirt with sin, you'll practice sin. And the church is going, we're going to be okay, Paul, you worrywart. You are just like, settle down. It's gonna be okay. And Paul's like, no, no, no. You don't understand. You are right on the edge of something bad. He verse 21 there, he kind of reiterates and gives another point that maybe even some of them were saying, okay, I understand, Paul. I shouldn't um, fellowship or partake of the meat there. Okay, but don't worry. I'm still doing the Lord's Supper idea and I'm practicing that truth and that principle in my life. Notice what he says. Like they're trying to ride the fence, right? Like, okay, all right. Okay, so I'm not supposed to be all in over there. So I'm going to put my right foot there, okay? But don't worry, my left foot's over here, right? And we're thinking that's okay with God, right? Right? We tell God, hey, God, don't worry. I was at church and acting like a Christian on Sunday, but the rest of the week it's kind of for me to do. This is my life to live. And we like negotiate with God thinking that God's going to be like, "Oh no, I get it. No, it's okay. You can worship you and me at the same time. It's all right." It's not true, is it? I mean, we just read in Exodus chapter 20 that God is a jealous God. And here he says in verse 21, he says that you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partaker of the Lord's table and the table of devils. You can't fellowship in both. You can't have fellowship in both. God will not. God's simply telling you this: if you choose to have fellowship with the idols and the worship of this world, he says, then you have no fellowship with me. It's one or the other. God doesn't share his fellowship. God is deserving of all of our fellowship. I don't think I need to go down the list today, but God has done so much for us and continues to do so much for us that he is deserving of our complete fellowship with him. So Paul says, wait, you can't do both. You can't participate in both. Matter of fact, if you choose to try to do that, really all you're doing is disgracing the Lord's table. You can't consistently do both. And he's warning them that you have to choose a side. You have to make a decision. Who are you going to follow? Who are you going to worship? Verse 22, to tempt to sit at both tables is to provoke God to jealousy. What do you think you're doing? Paul says. You're pushing the hand of the Lord. Lord doesn't share allegiance. Lord doesn't share love and worship, nor should he have to. When's the last time the devil did anything good for you? I hope the answer to that is never, because that is the truth. He's done a lot of good for himself at your expense, but he truly has never done anything good for you, not like what the Lord has done for you. So he says, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? We're not stronger than God. And we must not think that we can overcome the temptations or the culture of sin. You can't overcome that. You're not immune to it. I can hang out in sin and I'll be okay. That is a lie. God's a jealous God. He suffers no rivals, no comparisons, no alternatives. Paul says, church, be careful. You are on the brink of doing something you thought you would never do. And that is worship something other than God. Can I tell you this morning? Every one of us are in danger of that, or could be in danger of that. No one is, I've said it already, no one's immune from sin. If we're not careful, every one of us could find ourselves worshiping something other than God himself. How do we get there? What's the cause of us getting to that point where we would serve something other than God? The wonderful theologian, pastor, and author A.W. Tozer said this: Christianity at any given time is strong or weak depending upon her concept of God. And I insist upon this, and I have said it many times, that the basic trouble with the church today is her unworthy conception of God. Our religion is little because our God is little. I believe Tozer's onto something there, and I would agree with him. We think little of God, and you'll think that dining, that you'll think that flirting with sin is okay. When we have a little perspective of God, we will think that dancing with sin and tempting ourselves with sin and allowing sin to hang around us and to walk into places where there's the chance of following after deeper sin, we'll think it's not a big deal if we think little of God. Where we don't give him the honor and the respect and the love that he deserves. We don't give him the commitment, right? We're not fully following after him. Look, if we have a little view of God, we see no need to follow after him. We have no desire to pursue after what he has for us to pursue after if we have a small perspective of God. See, the problem maybe isn't so much that we need to be careful of going into those places that we would that might pull us away from God. Maybe we just need to make the focus of just getting closer to God, pursuing after God, growing in our knowledge and our understanding of God, getting in his word, falling on our face before him, and lifting God up. Maybe we just need to get more focused on worshiping God. If we would get so focused on worshiping God as we should, we would not have time to worship anything else. Maybe we've just made too much room for something else to come in. Maybe all we need to do is just worship God more. That comes with a bigger view, perspective of God. Church, I want to warn you this morning Flee not just idolatry, flee sin. Don't flirt with sin. Don't give sin a chance to influence you. I'd say it all the time, but I'd rather err on the side of being overcautious when it comes to sin than to err on the side of being too comfortable with sin. We do it all the time. We flirt with sin. And I'm not saying that we need to run around this world and in some kind of bubble or go into hiding so that we don't, fall into sin somewhere. Look, I understand. I'm very aware that sin is around us everywhere, right? You can't avoid it sometimes. And because of that, you know what? We probably should be more diligent about being careful about not placing ourselves in a place where we could sin. Like it's hard enough having it float around everywhere then place myself in a situation where I might sin. And you may even be looking at the situation and going, "Well, it's not that bad, and really, it's okay, and it won't be a problem." And but can I tell you, the more you flirt with that sin, the more comfortable you become with it, and before long, you were in and out, and but now you're kind of tearing a little bit longer, right? We're kind of milling around that sin a little bit more, and maybe we'd only do it for an hour. And we're like, "Oh man, I got to get going," and so we get going. But the next time we come back for our meat, we not stay but an hour, but we stay a whole day. And you get the point that before long, we're not we're not even thinking about eating the meat anymore. Now we're in the temple and we find ourselves actually taking the meat and sacrificing it to an idol. We have given in to sin. We have sacrificed our lives to sin. And we're going, how did I get here? You got here because you didn't practice the doctrine, the truth of separation from sin, of guarding yourself, of, of not just seeing how close you can get, but fleeing from it. No matter how pure and doctrinally strong you may think you are, you will be influenced by sin. There's no one in here that's immune to sin. No one. And if you think you are, you've taken the first step. You're flirting with it. No one is. It's impossible to walk through a coal mine and not get dirty. So it is impossible to snuggle with sin and not be tainted. I love Psalm verse 1. Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor sitteth in the way of the sinners, nor standeth in the way of the sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And it goes on to say what happens through his life and what his life becomes because of that. But I get the picture here of a man. What we're talking about is a man who doesn't flirt with sin. He doesn't walk in the counsel. He doesn't stand in the way. He doesn't sit in the way. He avoids it completely. And can I tell you, that's exactly what we flip it around. That's exactly what it looks like to flirt with sin. First, we're kind of walking in the way. We're kind of walking around. We walk by it, and we're like, yeah, maybe, no, yeah, no, yeah. And then before long, we stop at the window. We look in. We're like, it don't look that bad. I mean, it's kind of pretty, really. Looks kind of fun. No, 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 no. I can't do that. I can't do that. And maybe we do that a couple days, and we stand and we look and we look and we look at sin. Can I tell you, you keep looking and standing, before long you'll be sitting. You'll be sitting right there in the midst of that filth, and you'll ask yourself, how did I get here? One of my favorite verses found in Romans. Actually, two of them, but Romans chapter 13, verse 14. But put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. And I've already mentioned 1 Thessalonians 5:22, abstain from all appearance of evil. Well, that means I'm going to have to go somewhere else to get my meat. Yep, it may mean you have to go somewhere else to get your meat, but can I tell you, it'll be worth it. This life is hard enough as it is. I don't need to invite sin into my life. I haven't said it, but be careful how we invite sin into our life. Can I tell you, it's happening in our homes? Well, I mean, it's only this rating, or it only has a little bit of this in it, or a little bit of that in it. Can I tell you, you're flirting with sin? Garbage in, garbage out, right? I mean, the music we listen to, the people we hang out with, you know. Be careful how we're inviting sin into our life. That's not something you want to catch. These young men, they flirt with a girl and they hope to marry her one day, and I hope some of them get married one day. And maybe she'll be a great catch for him, whatever it may be. He'd be a good catch for her. But when you're flirting with sin, there is never a chance that you should say, "Oh, I hope I catch that," because no, you, we don't need sin. We're not supposed to have sin in our lives. Paul could see something, and he's warning the believers there in Corinth. Can I kind of like Paul tell you, be careful and flee from sin. You won't go wrong. Let's stand. Heads bowed, eyes closed.